Hi, Sarah. Hi, Judy.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing okay.
Hey, Barrett. Hey, Lacey.
Good morning.
Morning. How are you?
Good.
Good.
My first day of classes,
Ooh.
so getting it going.
Yeah. How's it going?
Um, I have to be patient because it's slow work and it almost feels like a new job in some ways. So it's going well.
Good.
I'm really excited to be here. Yesterday was so great.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad everybody was able to join. I know that this time of year is kind of not ideal, especially given the kind of current circumstances. So I hope this helps. And I think, in taking, just even everybody taking you and everybody else taking the time out to join is wonderful. So one question I had, and I'm going to ask the group when everybody gets in here, is I was thinking if everybody found yesterday to be enjoyable and beneficial, tomorrow we could actually translate another poem together. Something a little shorter. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Does everybody have their coffee? We've got a couple more people sort of trickling in, so I'll give it a couple more minutes and then we can get started. Morning, Susan. All right, let's just give it 1 or 2 more minutes and then we can jump in. Okay, let's get started. How is everybody today?
Good, good.
Good, awesome. So I wanted to kick today off by just sort of getting, feedback from anybody that's comfortable sharing regarding yesterday's, the translation process that we went through. Also, just to addressing any questions that may have popped up in your head after we kind of closed up shop yesterday. So I'll open it up to the floor to see if anybody wants to share or if there are any questions.
I'll go first if everyone's being shy.
Okay, sounds good.
Because I had some teachers over in the afternoon who had done this work. You might remember Elizabeth from the training here in February 2 years ago, whenever it was. Anyway, so I was describing to her how we had done it digitally. And she thought from her classroom experience that sometimes having pairs, the pairs became very possessive about their initial translation. And then when they went to quartets or groups of four, sometimes it was harder to navigate. And she thought for digital and classroom management purposes, it might be okay to try triads and just do the whole process through. So that was just a thought that she had just in terms of classroom management. And she thought it might be kind of hard to keep track of all the pairs and then the quartets if you're doing breakout rooms, whatever. So that's just a classroom management thing. And then I was rereading this article on what makes a good translation. And I think that's a discussion that we might like put in the parking lot and have a little later on, because I know the students have it all the time. Like, is it fidelity to the text? Is it a practical, like word for word, like accuracy thing? Or is it really more of an aesthetic, artistic, creative thing? And then I would also address how, reading through it multiple times with every iteration is really a dynamic reading process. So I wanted to just reinforce the reading as well as the writing aspects. And then I was still like highlighting all those standards, and it's just amazing to me how much of the standards are covered in this whole process, especially if students are doing just a little bit of writing about it. But then in this article I was just reading, it said all translators are servants of the text and the poet as well as artists. And it requires sensitivity, empathy, flexibility, attention, caring, tact. You have to be respectful of your own reading and writing processes as well as of the group, and respectful of your work. And I thought, I don't see that language captured anywhere in standards. I know it is in social justice standards. But I thought that's interesting to remember as social justice work that we're doing this in groups.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. So well, I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of hit upon some translation tips. So Susan, I think that's a great time to kind of bring in the stuff that you had found. Yeah, I think the social justice element of this is huge, especially when you take into context the multicultural aspects and the elements that can be brought into play. And like I said, yes, tomorrow we'll get into sort of the themes that surround the works that we have currently in the catalog. And we'll address some of those points too. One of the other things too, I think, when you're speaking about triads, I think within the context of the classroom, that would work. It definitely is something given distance learning. The Zoom platform is wonderful, and obviously you can do breakout rooms. And we saw yesterday, it works well when it comes to doing group translations and then bringing the group back together. It's a little wonky if you want to do pairs. That requires some pre-planning, being cognizant of who is already in a pair and then breaking those pairs up or bringing them back together. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Yeah.
I think she was thinking about the actual dynamics of having four people, how it might, especially since you don't know, presumably, your students at the beginning of the year,
right?
But it might lead to the shy one really pulling back and the dominant one or two like really dominating the group. And just for balance, she just thought a triad might work better. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, and if anybody in this group wants to give that a shot within their classroom, I would love to hear hear how that goes. One of the just to sort of a really quick side note, One of the things that I developed at the end of last school year for a couple teachers that is contained within this mysterious teacher's toolbox that we'll delve into tomorrow are what I was referring to as translation kits. So they're small packets of poems, some catalog and some scaffolding stuff that's in there for teachers, as well as a translator's guide. So the idea being is that they can be distributed for independent work at home, activities that can be done independently of group activity, so things like that. But we'll dig into that tomorrow.
Okay.
Cool.
I had a question.
Yes.
And this kind of came up in our group where, kind of our first response was, should we just do this separately and then share with each other? And I was wondering, as you go up in the different grade levels, do you ever have a situation where students are doing the phrase by phrase themselves and then sharing with a group of 4? And is that something that you don't recommend for specific reasons, or how do you typically deal with that?
So
that was the question.
That's a great question. So it's kind of, there's 2 parts to that. One, if you're in the context of, if we were operating in a standard classroom setting, I would say no. I would say you really need to have pairs or triads, as Susan brought up. There just needs to be active discussion and active sort of deliberation and sharing of ideas right from the get-go. Now, if you were to distribute a poem page to students and say, we're going to be translating this, within the next day or 2, and, providing some structure and allowing students to work independently and then bring their work to the group. And the end result then again is an agreed upon phrase by phrase and an agreed upon make it flow. Yeah, then I don't see a problem with that at all. As long as and the reason I mention that is because you want to get away from that sort of like, well, I'm going to take my stuff and just go work over here. Which you see inevitably. I think, some people in general are just really, some are very comfortable working alone and doing that. And others obviously are group workers and group thinkers and, and want to sort of construct meaning together. So, you have to be sensitive to those things. But like I said, I think as long as the end point is that they are working towards an agreed upon translation, an agreed upon phrase by phrase and an agreed upon make it flow, then I don't see a problem with it.
I had, when we left yesterday, I had thought about how this would play out in my classroom, play out differently with 11th graders who, when we retext, get so passionate, like to the point of cursing each other out about what the thing is going to be. And then also to Susan's point about kids being silent and then us, talking about equity of voice in classroom. So I think that this is the opportunity I would with kids to think about how they're operating together and talk about before we even start how maybe everybody has a certain amount of time to share. Because I wouldn't want anybody to feel like they couldn't share, but I also know in the conversation, I'm the type of person or kid who's gonna get my point across.
Yeah.
So making sure that everybody has different modes to do that in a respectful way, I think serves double purpose of teaching our students how to collaborate.
Go ahead, sorry.
In addition to that, there was also a point when we were thinking about the poem and the interpretation, and we paused because we all assumed, even beyond the definition, after we checked the definition, but in one part of the poem, we assumed that he had a wife. We assumed he was a straight man. And so we went back to see, like we were choosing significant other or wife, but also thinking about like what mindsets we can talk about in class or biases we might be able to lift up as we manipulate or change interpretations of the poem. Like, was it a wife? And I mean, it seems like it, right? Because he said it in his biography, but what does that mean that we automatically said he was married to a woman? And how might that affect our interpretations of other poems?
Yeah, I think those are both valid points, and especially that last one, sort of it brings about it gives you the ability to and makes you question your own assumptions about obviously his relationship. But as you move into different poems, you work with different subject matter, you know, assumptions of different cultures, assumptions of different, you know, genders, all of that. Yeah, all of that. One of the things, so, you know, one of the, your first point about people being quiet and, you know, and all that, one thing that I always encourage folks to do, and I think most teachers do this to begin with, in the beginning of the, you know, obviously establishing rules, you know, what does it mean to negotiate? What does it mean to be respectfully, you know, to respectfully disagree with another individual and then state your case? How do you learn from another and then have that enrich your own thinking process? But when we dive into this, one of the other things too that I always say is, you know, before you begin this process with your class, you know, with your students, I think, you know, the first thing really, it all starts with thinking about your students. And what that means is, you know, who are they individually, culturally, linguistically, just, you know, as people, and then who are we as a group? What do we value as, you know, as a class? And, you know, and then, and from that perspective, then bringing this to play. But, you know, I'll say this a couple more, you know, I'll say this probably continuously throughout the day or throughout the session. It really does start with thinking about your students. Why are we here? What are we doing? You know, we're not undertaking this. And when I say this, I mean the process of education to pass time, to keep ourselves occupied. There's a goal in mind. And what is it? And what do we cherish and what do we value as a group? Yeah.
Mark, I'm glad you said that, because I also, like Barrett, went home and thought about this some more, and I was thinking about that I would not start this activity until I had built my sense of community within the class, and everyone felt secure and free to share. My other thought is I've worked extensively with struggling readers, and my concern is I don't want to put you in that position so early in the year where you're already, it's very hard for you to grasp these words on the definition side, which may seem all very easy to us, but not everyone. Right. So I need to give that a minute until the middle of the year to see where everyone's reading level is. And then I'm glad that you said something about some scaffolding materials, because then I'm going to need a little differentiation with this. So I might have more than one, like if I had a group of kids, might have more than one like form of the translation paper. Maybe a little easier, maybe a one word, maybe in more depth than one. And then people can choose what they want to do and multiple copies of each. But this, I would be very cautious how I do this with my kids, because I don't want anyone to feel any type of way and really be able to contribute fully. My other thing is, I'm glad that you chose a Turkish person yesterday. And I thought to myself, I would never put a child in my class that didn't necessarily speak, or they might speak the language that we are talking about in the poem, and they might be able to understand it, but that doesn't mean that they can read and they can write it. So right. I'm not going to ask you to do all of that when that's very embarrassing to a kid, and they feel very shameful about that, and I would not do that either. So I was so glad that you had selected something that maybe isn't common for everyone and a little bit more different. So I was thinking about that as well, and I was glad to hear about the other choices that you had.
Thank you. And I'll add to, and for you and for everybody. So all of the poem pages are currently available when you have access to the Teacher's Toolbox that we'll dig into tomorrow. They're all PDFs. If you find that you are, you know, really wanting to be like, okay, the reading level on this is a little skewed, I'd like to change, you know, maybe, you know, keep the content of the biography, for example, but, you know, tailor it a little bit more to a couple of specific. I have Word versions of these, and I'm more than happy to provide them to you for that purpose, or even just work with you to, you know, help bring them. We've had some folks who have wanted to do reverse translations. So, for example, poem pages in Spanish or poem pages in it's actually always been Spanish, and then translating into English. And that's available also. It's not up on the website, but that's available also, because I think in some ways, especially with newcomers and second language learners, sometimes going through their L1 and then into a translation is a really good way to start out. So,
can I add something too?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, the first year I did this work in 2012, almost my entire class was reading way below grade level. but we had done some work because I'm a writing project experienced person. We had done a lot of work that year with reading protocols, where one of the things we might do is I might hand out a 1-page or a 2-page piece of text and say, read this home and I want you to look for, I would, itemize maybe 3 things I want them to pay attention to. Maybe how a character was described or how setting was written, or, 3 main ideas, whatever, like a little focused reading. And then they would come back and do discussion groups, but with a really strict protocol. And what that empowered was the kids who either couldn't access the text or hadn't done the homework, they were privy to those small group discussions. So they were familiarized with the text through that process, and then they felt more comfortable to participate. So that's one like protocol structure we had used during the year. So I think that made maybe the PO work just a little more comfortable. Also, when you read the poem aloud several times, kids who might not be able to read the text can hear certain things. They can hear cognates, they can hear rhyme, they can hear patterns in text. So I think that's really helpful to support those students. And I think we all have those students who are reading way below grade level. We also know that if you read something aloud that is 3 to 4 years above their reading level, they can understand it. So you're decoding for them as long as they have the text in front of them. So there are lots of ways to support students who are struggling with this work. But as soon as they start noticing and feel comfortable and safe to identify things that they're noticing or possible translations, because we're all thinking, feeling human beings, then that's when I saw the magic happen, that yes, I can participate. Yes, I can bring my observations to the classroom discussion. And that's when I really saw the whole dynamics in the classroom change. So they didn't feel excluded, even though they really couldn't do the work that everyone else was doing.
Yeah, but like you said, you built that community first with those norms. Right. So then you were able to do that. That's what I'm really stressing. Like I just don't think this is something you leap into lightly. And I think you have to be thoughtful of the students, like Mark was sharing, and like you were sharing, how you knew all your kids very well.
And that depends on the kids, because I've done this in the very beginning of the year and they just thought it was incredible. And I had one teacher at my middle school who did it the very first day of school. She did a Chinese poem, and that was just, she didn't know the students at all. Hi, Judy.
Hi. So I think it also depends on age and grade level too, a lot. So you're talking about 3rd grade, yeah, 2nd semester might make more sense. But I also wanted to say just about, we talked a little bit in our group about using poems, like the fact that it was Turkish, and that not using poems right away that were in the language of anyone in the classroom, just to have it be more of a level playing field. But I did want to say, I've done it, I've only tried it twice. I went through a little training with Susan about 1.5 years ago, and I tried it in a couple of 5th grade classrooms. And we had a student, we did a Mandarin poem, and there was a student who was not in that class, who was from another grade level, who could read. And she was asked if she would be interested in coming in. And she practiced it at home with her parents, and then she was more comfortable recording it. She didn't want to, she was younger. She was a 3rd grader. She didn't want to walk into a room full of 5th graders, but she recorded it. And then the kids could listen and see her doing that. We had a staff member come in also so it was kind of cool for the kids to learn something about their fellow students and staff that they had no idea this person, spoke Mandarin. They weren't Chinese. Yeah. And so that's kind of a cool thing too. I think it can be kind of a source of pride and an opportunity for kids to find out, oh my gosh, I had no idea you spoke this or could read this. So just a thought.
It's wonderful. I think that's, and I think all those steps too, it really, within the context of the classroom, the school, outside of that, all those things really go a long way to building building community, basically. I think people's just
but never on the spot. Never on the spot. Yeah. There was a lot of planning and permissions and things like that. So.
Well, one of the things that I talk about in Poetry Inside is this idea of depth over breadth, and I think that the part of this is especially in the beginning. This is not my phrase, but I'll use it nonetheless. It's it's a productive struggle. It is something that is uncomfortable at first and wonky, and it doesn't make sense to people. Some people love it, some people hate it. But I think that really, in the end, we all get to know each other a little bit better at first. But then I think, your grasp of the other and language and the importance of dialogue, of listening, and using that to enrich your own life, both, personally and academically, comes to bear. And I think that it's that process that is important, not only with Poetry Inside Out, but I think just in general. I think sometimes we lose that sort of that footing, the idea of time, the investment that we make into something like that. So, all right, should we get started?
Yeah.
Okay, PowerPoint time. All right. Before I jump into that, what I want to do, I want to share with you something. We discussed yesterday. I gave a kind of a really quick overview of, there we go, of PO, and I wanted to just also outline, as we go through this, you are becoming part of a larger community of practitioners that exist, and I wanted to just kind of give you guys a quick overview of what that means. Now, before I go any further, I need to give praise and full credit to Arzu, who is with us today, and her colleague, Todd Elkin, who I've been working with for the better part of almost 2 years now, just doing research on Poetry Inside Out, on the program. And we've just completed phase 2 or phase 1, and we're deep into phase 2. Anyway, this map, and I'll reference this work as we go forward, but this map came out of their work and they created it. So I want to give them credit for that. Anyway, so Poetry Inside Out, we are based, or I should say the program is based here in the Bay Area, but we have partners from around the country. Affiliates is what we refer to them as. But really they're thought partners, and they are friends, and some of you are affiliated with some of these sites, others are not. Whether you are or you're not, you are now part of this community. So I just wanted to kind of give you a real quick overview. So we have partner sites or affiliates in Worcester, Massachusetts, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, St. Louis, San Diego, and then of course here in the Bay Area. So the big blue squares you see are universities we're affiliated with. So the writing projects we're affiliated with are that of course attached to universities. So we have Phil Whip in Philadelphia, and then the University of Pennsylvania. And through them we work with a variety of teachers, a large number of which are with us today. Then up in Worcester, Massachusetts, we work with Clark University. And we also have there was an after-school program that was started by Sarah Michaels, who is a professor there, as well as G. Park, who is also a professor there. And I'll also talk a little bit about their work. I'll touch upon that briefly as we kind of go forward. In St. Louis, we work with the St. Louis Poetry Center, and with the Soulyard School, and then dispersed throughout the greater St. Louis area. San Diego, we work with the San Diego Writing Project, of which Susan is affiliated with, and the University of California, San Diego. And then of course here in the Bay Area, we work with the Bay Area Writing Project, which is based out of UC Berkeley, and we work with Oakland Unified and San Francisco, as well as teachers that are kind of throughout the Bay Area. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you, give you kind of a quick overview of which you are. So, and I said yesterday too, that one of the things that we've started doing is monthly kind of meetups, so teacher inquiry groups. So anyway, you will be invited to all of those, and I encourage you to attend. It's a great opportunity to connect with other teachers, share strategies, commiserate, And usually we have a topic around something that we're discussing. So it's relevant not only to PO, but I think it's also relevant to the practice of teaching in general. So any questions? All right, I'm going to jump right into so one of the questions that gets asked a great deal of me and of other people is sort of why translation and why poetry? You know, could you not do this program using prose? And what is it about translation? And the quick answer is you could use prose, but it wouldn't be the same. And really, the main reason is that translation is the closest form of reading. And since poetry is the densest form of writing, you combine those two and also throw in poetic device and the twists and turns that occur in the reading and writing of poetry, and you come up with this dilemma. And really, in its essence, in some cases, you know, Poetry Inside Out is a dilemma-based curriculum. And so it's the combination of these two things that provides the puzzle through which our students engage and through which, it's the engine that kind of turns all of this. So, and students who participate in Poetry Inside Out, we have found a number of things. One is that this close reading heightens comprehension. Precise writing enhances communication. Students really become to understand on a sort of a meta level as the mechanics of language, the workings of it, as you push and pull and sort of tear it apart and do that actively with others. You really have a sort of deeper engagement with the mechanics of language. Critical thinking. And of course, attentive listening builds new knowledge. I had mentioned Clark University earlier, and Sarah Michaels and G Park and are up there. And one of the things I had started a while back was the After School Poetry Club. And kind of a remarkable thing happened when they started this. They started it, and at the same time, the teachers that were engaged in it, and actually the video we saw yesterday was taken during this After School Poetry Club. One of the remarkable things that happened was the teachers that were coming in and working with the students were also on the side doing their own sort of their own teacher inquiry within the context of their own classrooms, but also in this club. And the students started to ask, well, what are you doing? And they said, well, we're doing, this is a teacher inquiry group, and this is why we're doing it. We're examining our practice, and we're asking questions about what we're learning. And students said, well, we're going through the same thing. Can we do our own research? And their response was, sure. So Sarah and G sat down with them, kind of gave them a kind of a quick primer on what it means to do research and how you do that. And then this initial set of students set about doing that and came up with their own thesis on their participation in their practice and their learning of this, and put together this paper and said that, so now what do we do with this? And she said, well, normally, you'd submit this to a conference, you present your paper to your colleagues. So they presented it to and submitted it to the Penn Ethnography Conference down at the University of Pennsylvania, and they were accepted. So this is 4 years ago now. So they went down, and the first year that they presented, the person who was in charge at that point of AERA happened to be in the audience and said, this is amazing. Would you guys like to present at this larger education research conference in a couple months? And they were invited to give one of the presidential presentations. And the reason I find this amazing is, first of all, the students that accomplished this were not students that you would normally think would be of this they think this process basically brought about in them this really fond appreciation for their own intellectual capacity. And I think as Sarah said, they began to see that their own thoughts, ideas, expressions had weight in the world. Well, since this group has done this initial group, they've had 3 different groups of students go through the same process. So they've done research, they have put together their own projects, submitted it, and have presented it 2 or 3 pen ethnography conferences. Well, the reason I bring all this up, and the reason this attaches to attentive listening, is one of the things that the last group of students came up with was this idea of special listening. And this is where Sarah's quote comes in. She says, one of the impacts that the students came up with was this notion of special listening. And the cool thing is that they actually theorized listening is dialogic, not just you're there, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm an individual, I'm listening, but that you could do special listening if you brought something to the table that you yourself authentically were interested in. So I think I love this quote because, and again, this was generated through Arzu and Todd's work. Sarah actually relayed this to them. I think it speaks to the power of the practice, but also to the change that can take place in students if you give them the opportunity to challenge themselves intellectually. So one of the things I mentioned yesterday too was that we kind of wanted to give flexibility to teachers and not be prescriptive and not be, boom, 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 this is the way you do this. Recognizing that in different spots in the country, in the world, in different schools, in different classrooms, different groups of students, this is going to manifest itself differently. Teachers are going to want to implement this in a variety of different ways, whether it be as a language program, a poetry program, whether it's a compendium to a history lesson, however. So we came up with what we call the 3 fundamentals and then the key practices of this curricula. If you are doing and implementing these fundamentals and the key practices, you are doing poetry inside out. Other than that, it's kind of open game. So the 3 fundamentals that comprise this, first is obviously translating poetry. And again, I'd said earlier about using prose or anything like that. It's really the act of translation, and specifically the act of the translation of poetry, and using the scaffolded or the poem pages one of which we worked with yesterday. So, and again, like I said, translation is really, it's the closest form of reading. By practicing the art of translation, students really come to a deeper understanding of the ways in which language works. And poetry is especially rich to translate because it requires a keen attention to vocabulary, the poetic form, syntax, grammar, rhythm, sound, and other nuances, both the source language, so the language the poem's written in, and then the target language, the language you're translating into. And since each word in a poem has a relationship to another word, a phrase, or a stanza, by moving back and forth from one language to another, and by considering the whole poem against its individual words and phrases, really students build an original version of the text. They're ultimately rewriting this work. And translation makes it evident that meaning is not found only in deciphering individual words, but by unraveling an entire version of the poem. The next fundamental is really talking and listening. So talking and listening are essential to this practice and this curriculum. By talking and by listening, students acquire the ability to communicate ideas, positions, perspectives, and knowledge. And in the same sense, students learn to listen. So it's a reference back to Sarah Michaels' quote earlier. And this emphasis on talking and listening is the foundation for building these meaningful collaborations, and also too, I think, building community and trust. One of the other things that Sarah Michaels has said that I love is that, you know, through this process, one of the things that she had found in her classroom and in this after school club was that it created a community of inquiry. Her students began to sort of understand what it meant to ask questions of themselves, of their peers, and just even of the text. And then at the same time coming back with something that then enriched their own perspective and then using that again. And that she's found that once you had that sort of practice in mind, you could take that lens and you could really turn it on anything. You know, then you can turn to science, you can turn to math, you can turn to those things. And the last is collaborate. And this combination of talking, careful listening, and doing something of consequence creates a positive learning environment, and one that values the voice of the other and supports collaboration. This also gets back to the question before, which I thought was a really great one, about having students work independently. And like I said, you know, I don't see a problem with that at all, as long as the endpoint that you're working towards is a time of collaboration, talking and listening, where you're working towards a final agreed upon translation. So, any questions? All right. So along with these key fundamentals, we have key practices. The first of which is to read aloud. So reading the poems and the translations aloud is obviously empowering, especially when a language is completely unfamiliar. Reading it out loud gives a sense of sound and structure and rhythm. I've said before, not all of, but a lot of the poems that are in languages that either we assume people there aren't going to be a lot of native speakers of, we have audio for. So we experienced that yesterday with the Nazim Hikmet poem. But really it's that, you know, giving that sense of sound, structure, and rhythm. And I would also say too, reading your translation aloud does the same. You know, and poets often use words because of the way they sound. So encouraging students to read poems and translate aloud, and even perhaps, especially when they're in progress, as a whole class and in a small group as often as possible. And this is really also too something translators do. I would also say, you know, taking a break to do this during the translation process, so it doesn't have to be a beginning and an end thing. Especially if there's a place where you're puzzling out a translation or you're puzzling out something. Re-listening to the audio, having somebody reread the poem in its original language, and then read the translation again and comparing and contrasting the two are all very powerful experiences. And then a focus on depth rather than breadth. So it's this gradual accumulative approach to learning that is really the stressor. You know, this sort of intentional process of sort of just really grinding through things that in the beginning for some are just really not comfortable or unfamiliar. So, you know, I'd say, you know, I encourage you all to go slow. Completing a single translation, I think I said yesterday, we moved really fast. You know, it should take, I would say, take several class sessions. Pace might pick up a little bit as you become more comfortable with things. But really, you want to allow time for conversations to emerge, to go deep, to take a, you know, to even sort of take a break, do some extra research on either, you know, specific language structures. You know, if it comes up like, okay, so, you know, we were discussing Nazim yesterday. You know, was he married? You know, who was he? What led him being imprisoned? Again, this gets back to this idea of first thing that appears when you see the poem page. Well, he's writing in Turkish, but it's listed as being, he's a resident, he lived within the Ottoman Empire. So the comparing and contrasting of those two. So it's, like I said, it's better to go deeper and you know, and then, you know, to go quicker, especially to, you know, delve into words, ideas, images, and really just embrace the idea of close reading. The third is an engagement with work, the work. So allowing, again, for conversations to emerge, for tangents to be explored, and, you know, really talking about language structure. Poets often use words that don't go well, that don't go together, or they write a word to create a mood or an effect or a sound. So in this process, students should be encouraged to contribute their own ideas about how to transfer meaning into a new language. And this is where this sort of productive struggle takes place. An interpretation of a poem often requires taking a position, and a translation requires difficult choices that need to be made, stances that need to be taken, and again, time and space should be allowed for those things to occur. Tapping into somebody's existing wisdom, as well as their linguistic and cultural knowledge and heritage. It's a personal experience, and the engagement with the work and the time allowed for those things to occur is incredibly important. And then the presentation and defense of work. So as students complete their translation, it's really important, and I think especially enriching for students, to be given the time to present their work as a group, their translations, to make it public, and allow for voices to be heard. When students, I think, when students sort of go through this, what I refer to as a productive struggle, and come out at the end with something that they've produced individually and as a group, allowing them to take the time to present and defend their work is something that I think is important, but also deeply enriching. One of the teachers that we work with here in San Francisco, she goes through this wonderful process where when her class is done with a specific translation, each individual group of 4 will go up in front of the class and present their translation. At the same time, the respective groups that are sitting, will be taking notes, and then we'll be given the opportunity to ask questions of that group regarding word choice, meaning, process that they went through to come up with that individual with that translation. So again, they're presenting their work. They're presenting their work, and they're obviously having to present and defend it to their peers. And then, of course, the biggest one, or one of the biggest ones, I think, is this idea of repetition. The essential practice, one of the essential practices of any art form is this act of repetition, and the act of experiencing and witnessing yourself become skilled, and watching yourself and watching your classmates kind of grow. And it's not only important when learning something like this, but also too, the idea of mastering something. Again, this productive struggle, and being able to watch yourself grow. So those are in essence the key practices and the key fundamentals of this program. If you are doing these things, you are doing poetry inside out. I will add to this, I will say, as you start, the best thing to do, the frequency with which you start is important too. I'm often asked, what does that mean? I would say, if you can, and if it's possible, 2 times a week. I know that's a lot. But it also doesn't have to be set aside time. It can be something that's integrated into, a history lesson, a language lesson, whatever it may be. You can use it to sort of shine a light on a specific topic, or maybe a specific theme that you're working on. But the students should have frequent touches on this to begin with. And as they gain confidence and more comfortable with it, that can be sort of, you can kind of step back a little bit, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. And then at that point, I have teachers who will use it once a month, or place it sporadically within lessons, again, to sort of allow for a deeper dive into either an individual's experience, a cultural experience, or an artistic, poetic experience. Any questions? All righty. So I had mentioned before that Todd Elkin and Arzu, who's with us today, I've been working with them on a research project for the better part of the last 2 years. One of the things, oops, sorry about that. One of the things that they did during the first phase of this workshop was they met with a lot of our affiliates, of which I kind of sketched out earlier, and asked them questions about their practice, and really asked them to respond to 7 specific questions. So a lot of information was kind of gathered from that. And Arzu, I'll ask you if I miss anything, or if you think there are some salient points that I'm not making, please feel free to jump in and fill those in. But one of the things that I found interesting were some core values that I think that everybody sort of said, these are parts of poetry inside out. So I wanted to just take a moment and discuss those. The first one is language learning. People spoke a lot about sort of how this practice elevates the awareness of language choices, especially building on multi and bilingual learners or working with them. And really that this sort of process kind of creates what is a sort of a constructivist language development. And it really enhances students' thinking and reasoning to build evidence-based arguments and connections. The other is poetry's work in the world. We try to be pretty specific about the poems we pick. With that said, I will say that if there are poems that either you find you love, students bring to class, if we do not have a poem page in a specific language that you're looking for, please let me know. Like I said, some of the poems we've been particular about and we've selected. Some are that really came from students and teachers. So, but the poems that we do select, they raise fundamental questions about what it means to be human. That's one of their goals. And I think it also gives voices to those who don't have it. And being able to experience, and also gives students and everybody really the ability to experience diversity. And the language and the opportunity to talk about the complexity of the world. And in a lot of cases, sort of fertile ground for them to plant their own linguistic and cultural heritage, and then a stage to bring it forth. And then the culture of classrooms. So students are a part of the linguistic landscape, and students' engagement, their social emotional value, and really the I've mentioned before the sort of this idea of culture of inquiry. This process really does bring about all of those things, but more importantly too, I think it really cements a cultural, and I'll add to that, community within classrooms. All right, any questions? If I'm moving too quickly, please let me know. And also too, a lot of what I'm covering is going to be in the teacher's guide that you all have. So if you feel like you missed something, obviously where everybody's going to get the video, but you can also return to that guide, and a lot of this will be in that guide. So tomorrow we're going to jump into the teacher's toolbox and kind of delve into what's in there and its uses. So I thought today what I would do is kind of quickly go over a couple things. One is sort of this idea of organizing a unit. And when I say a unit, what I mean is a collection of poems that are based around sort of obviously some sort of thematic, some sort of thematic or a theme. The other is, and I'm also going to get into some translation tips. And Susan, you had discussed or brought up the topic earlier, so I'd love to hear from you again when we get to that. So when you're organizing a unit, there are some guiding questions. And the first is taking the time to assess existing resources. one of the things that I talked about earlier was this idea of starting with your students. And it really, that's exactly where it starts. The second you decide that you are going to do this, the first question is, who are my students? Individually, collectively, who are they linguistically? What is their linguistic heritage? What is their cultural heritage? Who are we as a group and what do we value? But also too, the community of which, what is this, then going out to the larger school, and then the community from which they're coming from. And then also too, why am I doing this? Am I doing this? We're not doing this to pass time. And this goes beyond to the idea of, well, I'm doing this because this is a poetry unit, or I'm doing this because we're going to do a unit on immigration, or we're going to do a unit on revolution and resistance, and that's why I'm selecting these poems. But what do I really hope for my students to get out of this? Is this a community building exercise? Do I want students to sort of feel the weight of their own intellectual capacities and really become empowered in that? Do I want to build a deeper sense of community? And so asking those questions. And then the next obviously is assessing existing resources. So one of the first questions is, what language resources do my students bring to the classroom? What do they have with them? Who are they linguistically, culturally? A lot of times students, will interpret for their parents. Having a discussion about what does it mean to translate and what does it mean to interpret is a positive one. But really, again, who are my students and what language resources do they bring to the classroom? And the next is, what do they have available to them? So in addition to thesauruses and dictionaries and things that might exist within the classroom, this really too is about what's available to them. What languages are spoken at home? If there's a language spoken other than English, what languages are spoken in their communities? Spoken by grandparents. And then also too, these conversations can occur prior to sort of engaging in this practice, sort of surfacing all of those things. And then again, what's the culture of my classroom? What do we value as a people? What do we value as a group? What do we value as individuals? And really also too, setting some guidelines as you kind of go into this. What does it mean to, how do we respectfully engage with people? How do we respectfully disagree? What does it mean to learn something from another and have that enrich your own experience, and then use that to come back and ask further questions? So, and then picking the focus of the unit. And we'll get into this a little bit deeper tomorrow when we take a look at the poem page catalog. But the first is sort of asking the question, what kind of unit makes sense for my classroom? And what that means is, thematically, well, again, why am I doing this? Is this going to be something that is, a compendium to another piece of curricula? Am I doing this because I'm wanting to do a unit on, again, revolution resistance or nature or whatever it may be? And then, the length of it. I always say that one of the things too, if you're going to construct a unit, and you would I would say, and you're going to pick, let's say, 6 poems that you're going to try and cover over said period of time, be comfortable getting rid of at least 1, if not 2. And the reason I say that is, more often than not, you will find yourself lingering on specific, a theme, a line of discussion, a tangent that emerges, some research that that takes place. So you want to allow for that flexibility, and this gets back to that idea of depth over breadth that I mentioned earlier. And then considering the focus of your unit and your classroom populations, what poems serve your purpose? I apologize, I keep referencing to tomorrow, but within the poem page catalog, or poem page library, we have a catalog. And the catalog is something that will allow you to basically pick poems based on their complexity, the themes that are addressed, the poetic devices that are employed, the language, the culture, the country of origin. So the reason it exists that way is so that you can do this. So, again, asking what unit makes sense, and then based on that, what poems are going to basically meet those needs, and are going to be the best that will reflect the linguistic and cultural makeup of my classroom, while at the same time addressing the themes that I want to address. And now we get into translation. Susan, I'm going to kind of lay some of these out. If there's things, as this fits with what you were mentioning earlier, please feel free to jump in. Okay. So when you're translating, a couple things to remember. One is consider that there's more than one correct translation of a word, a phrase, a sentence, and for that matter, a poem. I was really happy that no one asked me yesterday, no one asked to see the translation. Sometimes that happens, and it's as if there is one correct translation. We're all working towards one sort of like, okay, now here it is. This is the agreed upon professional translation, and let's see who got closest to it. And that just doesn't exist. So, remember that there is more than one, there's one correct translation of a word, a phrase, a sentence, and of course, a poem. Good translations sound natural and they make sense to the translator. So in this case, the student. And I will add too, most of these points come from, we did a 2-day retreat with a number of translators that we work with, asking them to take a look at our poem pages, asking them to take a look at the curriculum, and really, said, as students and teachers engage with this, what do you think they need to know? What would you tell them as a translator? And they said, these are some of the things that came out. So a translation often, not always, follows the form of the poem. Sometimes the word order or the syntax changes in the translation. This is inevitable when you're moving from a source language into the target language. Things will be lost. Word order changes, of course, things like that. So one of the things, and I wish I had it on me right now, but I don't, but I'll show you tomorrow, is the translation of the Basho poem. Like I had said yesterday, there are, I think this poem's been translated thousands of times. Very, very simple haiku. Each translation is just completely and totally different, but they all convey the quote unquote meaning and paint the picture that Basho was painting originally. In order to translate a line that carries the meaning of the original, you have to consider the context, and which at the very least includes all the words of the poem. So individual words, but then those words that surround it, and then all the words within the poem itself. Of course, the poem's title. What is known about the poet, his or her country, culture, history, language, so on and so forth. And again, this is also this also is part of sort of opening it up to further research. Anything that you can garner that, or your students can pull together, doing their own individual research that adds context to the poem, the poet, the time when the poem was written, the language, the culture, is relevant and will really go a long way to deepen the experience of this process. So, and when you begin a translation, use your knowledge. And when I say yours, I mean not only your knowledge as individuals, as teachers, but also students. So the work you're translating, including, again, all of the context provided on the poem page and additional resources and related materials. So those can be anything, thesauruses, dictionaries, but also to additional resources, research, things of that nature. On some poem pages, we have attached, and you will find background information. We're also in the process of migrating. Right now, all of our current curricula exists on Google, it's temporarily parked in Google Drive. By the end of the year, it's going to be migrated onto the center site. When that does occur, when we open that up, probably in December, there will be additional materials. So, for example, if you are translating the haiku by Basho, we'll have more information on Japan, the language, the time in which the poem was written, Basho himself. All of that is meant to provide context for reference during the translation process. And then the language the work was written in, the original language, and of course the language you're translating into, the target language. There was an article written a while back, and I cannot remember where it was published, but it was wonderful, and it was written about talking about this idea of language in its relationship to time. And the author, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Arrival, but in it, the lead, she's a linguist, and she's sent to sort of communicate with these aliens who have come to Earth. And one of the things that allows them to time travel is the way they refer to time, the language they use to express it. And that also exists in a lot of the languages that we work with as we're translating. And it's not only time, it's references to space, to nature. So again, taking the time to sort of dig into those and be aware of them also as well. Frequently a turn of phrase, or again, a reference to some sort of spatial reference means one thing in one language, and because it means one thing in one culture, and it means something completely and totally different in English. So, being aware of those things not only enriches the translation process, but I think also deepens an appreciation provides a deeper appreciation for that culture, for that language, and, provides a different perspective. And then obviously use your knowledge, good resources, dictionaries, thesauruses, people familiar with the original language, whether it be other students, people outside of the classroom, faculty members, parents, grandparents, the individual who works at the corner store, all of these things. All of them are great resources. I'm frequently asked about using Google Translate. I am not a big fan of a Google Translate, possibly for individual words, but definitely not for whole bodies, and definitely not for poetry. An interesting activity is to take a poem, punch it through, let's say take a poem in Spanish, punch it through Google Translate into English, and then put it back into Spanish. So I shy away from it. I encourage, when applicable and when relevant, the use of, dictionaries and thesauruses. Not that they can't be electronic, but I'm also a sucker just for good old bound books. And then remember, you can't possibly capture every aspect of the original language, and you can't avoid adding something in the new language. And again, this gets back to, and this is sort of, again, that sort of really rich soil that, dialogue takes place in, and that debate can occur. So any questions? All righty. Well, I think we're gonna, if we don't have any questions, we're gonna pack up a little bit early today. Like I had said, the material I covered, first of all, I apologize because I kind of whipped through it really, really quickly. All of it is available and is contained within your teacher's guide. So if you missed anything, you'll of course get the recordings of this session, but you can also refer to them there. So tomorrow, we're going to get online. I'll share my screen. We'll dig into the teacher's toolbox and the resources and the poems that are contained within. And we will take it from there. Okay. Thank you all so incredibly much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mark. Thank you. Bye-bye,
You're welcome.
everyone.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, you too.
See you tomorrow morning.
Manya.